I never thought I would become the kind of woman who could destroy her own life in one reckless decision. But if I was honest with myself, it wasn't a decision, it was a slow descent, an unraveling that I let happen. And now, sitting in this empty house, haunted by memories that refuse to fade, I wonder if I ever truly understood the man I married. For years ago, I went on a business trip that changed everything. I remember the argument with Ethan as if it happened yesterday. "You don't need to go," he said, his voice tight with barely contained frustration. He stood in our bedroom doorway, arms crossed, watching me pack. "I do," I replied, forcing myself to sound unaffected. "It's a major deal, Ethan. If I pull this off, it means a promotion, a raise, everything we've worked for." Ethan shook his head. "Everything we worked for? You think I give a damn about your promotion when I know exactly what this trip is about?" His words sent a cold shiver down my spine. He knew. I forced a laugh, closing my suitcase with more force than necessary. "You're being ridiculous." Ethan stepped closer, his piercing blue eyes never leaving mine. "Am I?" His voice dropped, controlled but dangerous. "Then tell me, Claire. Tell me why you're suddenly taking overnight trips, why your phone has new passwords, why you're so damn distant. Look me in the eyes and tell me you aren't seeing someone else." My breath hitched. He had never confronted me so directly before. My heart pounded, but I met his gaze with all the defiance I could muster. "I don't have to explain myself every time I travel for work, Ethan. You're being paranoid." A muscle twitched in his jaw. "You know what? Go. Take your damn trip. But don't expect me to be here when you get back." I hesitated. For a split second, I saw something in his eyes that almost made me reconsider. But I couldn't. I had already crossed a line I could never uncross. So I grabbed my suitcase, brushed past him without another word, and walked out of our home. I should have turned around. The flight to Chicago felt longer than it was. I spent most of it trying to convince myself that Ethan was just being dramatic, that he would be fine in a few days. After all, I had convinced myself that what I was doing wasn't that bad. Todd, my boss, was charming, powerful, and attentive in ways Ethan hadn't been in years. He made me feel alive. It started innocently, late-night meetings, lingering conversations, harmless flirting. But somewhere along the way, I let it become more. And now, as I landed in Chicago, I knew exactly what this trip was. It wasn't about work. It was about spending the weekend with Todd, wrapped in the luxury of a 5-star hotel, away from the life I was supposed to be loyal to. The guilt only hit me in fleeting moments, when Ethan's voice echoed in my mind, when I saw the missed call from him after I landed. I ignored it, letting the thrill of secrecy push aside my doubts. Todd was waiting for me at the hotel, a knowing smirk playing on his lips as he held out a room key. "You're finally here," he said, brushing a kiss against my cheek. "I've been waiting." I smiled, slipping the key card into my purse. "I'm here now." If I had known what was coming, I would have run in the opposite direction. The first sign that something was wrong came just after midnight. Todd had fallen asleep beside me, his arm draped lazily across my waist. I was reaching for my phone when I heard a knock on the hotel room door. Frowning, I slid out of bed, wrapping myself in a robe before checking the peephole. My heart stopped. "Ethan." I stumbled back, my mind scrambling for an explanation. How? How did he find me? The knock came again, firmer this time. "Claire. Open the door." Todd stirred behind me. "Who is it?" he muttered sleepily. I couldn't breathe. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. I opened the door just enough to slip outside into the hallway, my heart hammering against my ribs. Ethan stood there, his expression unreadable, his stance calm, too calm. A man on the verge of something unstoppable. I can explain," I started, but he cut me off with a sharp shake of his head. Don't, he said quietly, reaching into his coat pocket. This isn't a discussion, Claire. And then he handed me a thick envelope. I stared at it, confusion and dread twisting inside me. I flipped it open, my breath catching as I saw the bold, unforgiving words staring back at me. Divorce petition. I looked up at Ethan, my vision swimming. Ethan, please. But he was already turning away. I reached for his arm, but he pulled back sharply, his voice cold and final. You made your choice. Now live with it. And then he was gone. The days that followed were a blur. Ethan disappeared without a trace. No calls, no texts, no response from his family or friends. It was as if he had ceased to exist. I tried everything. I called his job, he had resigned. I checked our bank accounts, emptied. Even the house was gone. Within days, my husband had erased himself from my life entirely. Todd was supportive at first, but as the weeks passed, he grew distant. I wasn't the exciting secret anymore, I was the woman who had been abandoned, who carried the weight of a ruined marriage on her shoulders. Within 2 months, Todd was gone too. I had lost everything. And now, 4 years later, after spending every one of those days regretting the choices I made, the past has found me again. Because today, I got a phone call. And the voice on the other end said the last thing I ever expected to hear. Claire, it's about Ethan. You need to come home. He's dying. When I hung up the phone, my hands trembled so violently I thought I'd drop it. The words echoed in my mind, louder than the buzzing of blood rushing through my ears. He's dying. I sat there, staring at the blank wall of my tiny apartment, the life I'd built from the ruins of my mistakes suddenly feeling like a fragile illusion. For 4 years, I had convinced myself that Ethan was just gone, somewhere far from me, living his life without a second thought about the woman who shattered his heart. But he wasn't gone. He was out there. And now, he was dying. The question wasn't why I should go. The real question was, why did it matter to me after everything? I thought I had buried Ethan in the recesses of my mind, filed him away with all the other mistakes I didn't have the courage to face. But hearing his name spoken out loud, Ethan, felt like someone had ripped open a scar that never truly healed. I paced the room, my heart racing with a cocktail of emotions I couldn't untangle. Guilt. Anger. Regret. And beneath it all, fear. Fear of seeing him. Fear of what he would look like now. Fear of facing the damage I caused, the wreckage I left behind when I chose Todd over the man who had given me everything. Todd. His name left a bitter taste in my mouth now. He had been the fire that burned through my marriage, the thrilling escape I thought I needed from the monotony of routine. But he'd been nothing more than a mirage, a distraction from the real problem. Me. Todd left me 6 months after Ethan vanished. No dramatic breakup, no screaming matches. Just a simple text, "This isn't working." It wasn't until he was gone that I realized I'd been holding on to him like a life raft, trying to convince myself that leaving Ethan was somehow justified because at least I hadn't ended up alone. But I was alone. Completely, the decision to go see Ethan wasn't a decision at all. It was an inevitability. Like gravity pulling me back to the ground, no matter how far I'd drifted. I packed a small bag, my hands moving on autopilot. It felt surreal, folding clothes and zipping up a suitcase like I wasn't about to face the man whose life I had detonated with a single choice. The flight was a blur. I stared out the window, watching clouds drift past, each one a fleeting snapshot of the life I used to have. I thought about the small things, how Ethan liked his coffee black with a single sugar cube, the way he'd absent-mindedly drum his fingers on the steering wheel when he was lost in thought, the way he'd pull me into his arms when he thought I wasn't paying attention. I hated that I still remembered those things. Hated that I still cared. When the plane landed, I felt like I was walking into a life that no longer belonged to me. The city was the same, familiar streets, familiar signs, but I wasn't the same woman who had driven away from here 4 years ago. I was a stranger coming home. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and sterile hope. I moved through the halls like a ghost, my footsteps echoing louder than I expected. The nurse at the front desk looked up, her expression neutral and professional. "Can I help you?" I cleared my throat, my voice weaker than I intended. "I'm here to see Ethan Hale." She glanced at her computer, typing with quick precision. "Are you family?" "Family." I swallowed hard. "I'm his wife." The words felt foreign on my tongue, like trying to wear clothes that no longer fit. She nodded, giving me a polite smile. "Room 317, down the hall to the right." I stood there for a moment, my legs refusing to move. I wasn't ready for this. I wasn't ready to see him, to see what time, illness, and heartbreak had done to the man I had left behind. But I forced myself to walk. One step after another until I reached the door. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the storm raging inside me, and then I pushed the door open. Ethan was lying in the hospital bed, pale and thinner than I remembered. His face was gaunt, framed by a shadow of stubble, his once vivid blue eyes now dimmed but still sharp, still Ethan. And he saw me immediately. His eyes locked onto mine, a flicker of recognition flashing across his face. But there was no warmth. No anger. Just nothing. "Claire," he said, his voice a rasp, brittle like old paper. I stepped inside, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "Ethan." He didn't smile. Didn't frown. Just stared. "I wasn't expecting you," he said quietly, his eyes narrowing slightly. I swallowed the lump in my throat. I got the call. I didn't know you were alive," he interrupted, a bitter edge to his voice. "Yeah, surprise." I flinched, the words hitting harder than I expected. There was a long silence, the space between us filled with all the things we left unsaid over the years. Finally, he broke the silence. "Why are you here, Claire?" I opened my mouth to answer, but I realized I didn't know. I didn't know what I was hoping to find. Closure? Forgiveness? Redemption? Maybe all of it. Maybe none of it. But before I could speak, Ethan's next words shattered whatever fragile hope I had. "You're 4 years too late." His words hit me like a slap across the face. "You're 4 years too late." I wanted to argue, to tell him it wasn't true, but the words stuck in my throat like shards of glass. Because he was right. I was too late. Not just by years, but by a lifetime. I stood there, frozen, unsure whether to step closer or turn around and walk away. But something in Ethan's eyes, something brittle and broken, kept me rooted to the floor. "I didn't know," I whispered finally, my voice trembling under the weight of everything I hadn't said in 4 years. Ethan chuckled, but there was no humor in it. It was the hollow, empty kind of laugh people make when the world's been too cruel to be funny anymore. "You didn't know," he repeated, shaking his head slightly. "Of course, you didn't. You were busy, living your life." I flinched. I deserved that. The room felt suffocating, the sterile white walls closing in around us. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only thing tethering me to the moment, a reminder that despite everything, Ethan was still here. Still breathing. But for how long? I cleared my throat, my fingers twisting nervously around the strap of my purse. "I didn't come here to argue," I said softly. I wanted to see you." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Why? So you can ease your guilt before I die?" The bluntness of his words knocked the air out of me. He had always been sharp-tongued when he was angry, but this was different. This wasn't anger. It was something colder. Something final. "No," I whispered. He cut me off with a wave of his hand, his frail arm trembling slightly from the effort. "Don't. Whatever speech you rehearsed on the plane, save it. I don't need it. I felt the sting of tears welling in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not yet. Not here. I never stopped thinking about you, I confessed, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's lips curled into something resembling a smirk, but it didn't reach his eyes. Yeah? That's funny, Claire. I stopped thinking about you the day I served you those divorce papers. The silence that followed was deafening. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but none of those fantasies prepared me for the reality. In my mind, he'd yell, scream, throw accusations. I could have handled that. But this cold indifference? It was unbearable. I took a tentative step closer. Ethan, please. I know I hurt you. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but... Stop, he snapped, his voice weak but sharp enough to slice through my words. You don't get to come back after 4 years and pretend like this is some heartfelt reunion. You made your choice. I swallowed the lump in my throat, my hands trembling at my sides. I'm dying, Claire, he continued, his tone softer now but no less brutal. There's nothing you can say that's going to change that. So why are you really here? I didn't have an answer. Not one that would make sense. Not one that wouldn't sound selfish. So I told him the truth. I don't know. I stayed, despite everything. Ethan didn't ask me to, and he certainly didn't make it easy. But I couldn't bring myself to leave. I sat in the corner of his hospital room, watching him drift in and out of sleep, the hum of machines filling the spaces where conversation used to live. In the quiet moments, my mind wandered back to the life we'd shared, the good parts, the ones I had buried beneath layers of guilt and regret. I remembered lazy Sunday mornings, tangled in sheets, laughing about nothing. I remembered the way he used to leave little notes for me around the house, inside coffee mugs, tucked into books, on the bathroom mirror. You're my favorite. Can't wait to see you tonight. I love you more than coffee, and that's saying something. I ruined all of that. I thought about the last time I saw him before everything fell apart. The way his eyes had darkened with betrayal when he handed me those divorce papers. The way he walked away without looking back. I never thought I'd see him again. And now, here we were. On the 3rd day, Ethan had a visitor. I was sitting by the window, lost in thought, when the door creaked open and a woman stepped inside. She was in her late 20s, her dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, her face sharp and striking. She held a small bag in one hand and a look of quiet sadness in the other. Ethan's eyes lit up in a way they never did when he looked at me. Hey, he rasped, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Hey, she replied softly, walking over to his bedside. She leaned down, brushing a gentle kiss against his forehead. I felt something twist in my chest. Who was she? She glanced at me then, her eyes cool and assessing. I didn't know you had company. Ethan's smile faded. Claire, this is Ava. Claire, this is Ava. The words echoed in my head like a slow drumbeat. I forced a polite smile, my heart pounding in my chest. Nice to meet you, I said, though it felt like the biggest lie I'd ever told. Ava nodded, then turned her attention back to Ethan, her fingers lightly tracing the veins on his hand. They didn't say much after that. Just exchanged soft words and quiet smiles, the kind that spoke of shared history, of late nights and whispered secrets. I sat there, feeling like an intruder in a life that no longer had space for me. And that's when it hit me. I wasn't here for closure. I was here because I never stopped loving him. And now, it was too late. Ava. Her name lingered in the sterile air long after Ethan introduced her. It echoed inside my chest, bouncing off the hollow spaces where my pride used to be. I sat in the corner of Ethan's hospital room, my hands clenched in my lap, trying to act like I wasn't suffocating. Ava's presence filled every inch of the space I thought I'd reclaimed simply by walking through the door. But I was wrong. She wasn't just a visitor. She was his. I watched her as she adjusted Ethan's blanket, her fingers moving with a tenderness I hadn't shown him in years, not because I didn't care, but because I'd forgotten how. She knew exactly how to tilt his water glass so he could sip without spilling. She knew how to make him smile, even when he was too tired to lift his head. And the worst part? He let her. The Ethan I remembered was fiercely independent, stubborn to the core. He hated feeling vulnerable, even with me. But with Ava, there was no pretense. No wall. She had what I threw away. I wanted to leave. God, I wanted to leave. But I couldn't. Instead, I stayed, a ghost haunting the room where I used to belong. Ethan didn't ask me to stay. Ava certainly didn't want me there. But something inside me, pride, guilt, desperation, kept me rooted to the chair in the corner, silently observing the life that had moved on without me. They talked like I wasn't even there. Ava told him about her day, casual things, like errands she'd run, a funny thing her friend had said. And Ethan listened. Really listened. His eyes softened in a way they never did when he looked at me. It was like watching someone else live the life I thought I deserved. At one point, Ava glanced over at me, her eyes cool and sharp. "You've been here a while. Don't you have somewhere else to be?" Her words were polite on the surface, but the meaning beneath them was clear: you don't belong here. Ethan didn't defend me. He didn't say, "She's my ex-wife. She has every right to be here." He just stayed silent. That silence hurt more than any insult could have. Later that evening, when Ava finally left, pressing a kiss to Ethan's forehead like she'd done it 100 times before, I found the courage to speak. "She's important to you," I said, my voice low, afraid of the answer. Ethan didn't look at me. He stared at the ceiling, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths. "Yeah," he said simply. That one word felt like a slap. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "How long have you two been?" He finally turned his head, his eyes meeting mine. There was no anger there. No resentment. Just exhaustion. "Long enough," he replied. I wanted to scream. To throw something. To feel something other than this dull, aching numbness. But I couldn't. Instead, I asked the question I'd been avoiding since I walked back into his life. "Did you ever love me? I mean, after everything?" Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "I did. I loved you so much it destroyed me." My breath hitched. He continued, his voice quieter now. "But loving you didn't stop you from leaving. And hating you didn't stop me from remembering what it felt like when you were mine." I closed my eyes, swallowing the tears that threatened to spill. "I'm sorry," I whispered. Ethan let out a dry laugh, one that held no humor. "I don't need your apology, Claire. I needed you to stay. But you didn't." The next morning, I found a letter tucked under my coffee cup on the small hospital table. It was written in Ethan's handwriting, messy, uneven, but undeniably his. I hesitated before opening it, my fingers trembling slightly. "Claire. If you're reading this, it means I didn't have the strength to say it out loud. So here it is. You were the first woman I ever loved. And for a long time, I thought you'd be the last. But life has a way of surprising us. I spent years hating you, not because of what you did, but because I couldn't figure out how to stop loving you even after you were gone. But hate fades. Love fades too. What's left is just the truth. You broke my heart, Claire. But you also gave me some of the best years of my life. I don't regret loving you. I just regret believing you'd never hurt me. I hope you find peace. I hope you find someone who makes you feel the way I used to make you feel, before everything fell apart. Goodbye." I read the letter twice. Then a third time. Each word carved deeper than the last. He had written goodbye like it was just another word. But to me, it was a final nail in the coffin of everything we used to be. I folded the letter carefully, tucking it into my purse like it was something precious, because it was. It was the last piece of him I'd ever truly have. I left the hospital that evening, unsure if I'd ever go back. But 2 days later, my phone rang. It was Ava. Her voice was tight, clipped. "You should come. It's time." I didn't ask questions. I just went. Because even after everything, I wasn't ready to say goodbye. When Ava called, her voice was flat, stripped of the sharp edges she'd used to keep me at a distance. She didn't have to say more. I knew what its time meant. Ethan was dying. I should have been prepared. I'd seen it in his sunken cheeks, in the way his hands trembled when he lifted a glass of water, in the shallow rise and fall of his chest. But nothing prepares you for the finality of death, especially when it's someone you once thought you'd grow old with. The drive to the hospital felt longer than it was. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, my mind racing with everything I wished I'd said to him when I had the chance. But regret has terrible timing. When I arrived, the hall outside his room was eerily quiet, the usual hum of hospital life dulled to a distant echo. Ava stood by the door, her face pale, eyes rimmed with red. She didn't say anything when she saw me, just nodded, as if this unspoken truce was the only thing we could offer each other now. I stepped inside. Ethan looked smaller than I remembered, swallowed by the thin hospital blankets, his face gaunt, lips slightly parted as he struggled to breathe. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was slower, irregular, a sound that felt like it was ticking down the seconds we had left. A nurse adjusted his four, gave me a sympathetic glance, then quietly slipped out, leaving me alone with him. I pulled the chair closer to his bed, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. "Hey," I whispered, my voice trembling. "It's me." His eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused at first, then slowly sharpening when they met mine. A flicker of recognition. A faint smile, just a ghost of the one I used to know. I reached for his hand. It was cold, fragile like thin paper. I wanted to warm it, to hold it tightly, but I was afraid I'd break him. "I'm here," I whispered, as if those words could somehow fix everything I'd broken. I didn't know what to say. What do you say to a man you betrayed, abandoned, and now can't save? So I said the only thing that mattered. "I'm sorry, Ethan. For everything." His fingers twitched slightly in mine, his lips parting as if he wanted to speak, but no words came out, just a soft, raspy breath. Tears blurred my vision, spilling down my cheeks unchecked. I leaned closer, my forehead resting gently against the edge of his bed. "I never stopped loving you," I choked out, the words tasting like regret and truth all at once. His breathing grew shallower, each inhale a struggle, each exhale a little weaker than the last. The heart monitor's beeping slowed, irregular pauses between beats. "Please," I whispered through sobs, gripping his hand tighter. "Don't go. I'm not ready." But death doesn't wait for apologies. It doesn't care about unfinished conversations or love that's too late. The final beep was long, continuous, a sound that carved itself into my soul. Ethan was gone, the days after his death passed in a haze. The funeral was small, intimate, just close friends, family, and Ava. I stood at the back of the service, unsure of where I belonged. I wasn't his wife anymore. I wasn't even his friend. I was just the woman who broke his heart. Ava delivered the eulogy, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. She spoke about Ethan's kindness, his stubbornness, his ability to find beauty in the smallest things. She painted a picture of the man I once knew, and the man I never got to meet, the one he became after me. After the service, as people slowly trickled out, Ava approached me. "He left something for you," she said quietly, handing me a small envelope. I took it with trembling hands, nodding my thanks though my throat felt too tight to speak. I waited until I was alone in my car before opening it. "Claire. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone." I thought about whether I should even write this, but there were things I needed to say, things I couldn't say while I was still alive because I wasn't sure I could handle looking at you when I did. You broke me. I won't sugarcoat that. What you did, it shattered the man I was. But over time, I realized something that surprised me. You didn't ruin me. I did that to myself by holding on to the idea of what we were instead of accepting what we'd become. I loved you, Claire. I probably always will, in some strange, distant way. But I forgive you. Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace. I hope you find peace too. Goodbye. I clutched the letter to my chest and sobbed, deep, broken sobs that shook my entire body. Not because he was gone. But because he forgave me when I couldn't even forgive myself. Months passed. Seasons changed. Life moved on, even when I felt like I couldn't. Then, one morning, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a woman's voice greeted me. Is this Claire Hale? My heart stuttered. It had been months since anyone called me that. Yes, I replied cautiously. This is Dr. Patel from St. John's Hospital. I'm calling regarding Ethan Hale's estate. I frowned, confused. His estate? Yes. I'm not sure if you were aware, but Ethan was part of a medical program. It was unconventional. You've been listed as the emergency contact and... I cut her off, my pulse racing. What are you talking about? A pause. Then. Claire. Ethan isn't dead. Ethan isn't dead. The words echoed in my mind, louder than the woman's voice on the phone. I sat frozen, the weight of disbelief anchoring me to the spot. My fingers tightened around the phone as if gripping it harder would make the words make sense. What did you just say? I whispered, my voice shaking. The woman on the other end, Dr. Patel, repeated calmly, as if she were explaining something simple. Ethan Hale is alive. We understand this may be shocking, but I assure you, it's true. I couldn't breathe. My vision blurred at the edges. My chest felt tight, like the world had collapsed inward, crushing me with the impossible. There was a funeral, I stammered. I was there. I saw. I understand, Dr. Patel interrupted gently. There's more to this than I can explain over the phone. It's important you come to the hospital. And then she gave me an address, not the hospital where Ethan had died. A different facility, somewhere on the outskirts of the city. I didn't ask questions. I just grabbed my keys and drove. The drive felt unreal, like I was trapped in someone else's life. The world outside passed in blurs of gray and green, but none of it registered. My mind raced with questions, each one more impossible than the last. How could Ethan be alive? Why would someone fake his death? Why didn't Ava tell me? The funeral had been real. The grief had been real. My pain had been real. So what was the truth? By the time I pulled into the hospital parking lot, a private facility tucked behind tall iron gates, I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down into the unknown. Inside, the hospital was stark, colder than the one where I'd last seen Ethan. The walls were pristine white, the fluorescent lights too bright, the air filled with an unsettling quiet. At the reception desk, I gave my name. The nurse nodded as if she'd been expecting me. Dr. Patel will meet you shortly, she said, gesturing for me to sit. But I couldn't sit. I paced the small waiting area, my thoughts spiraling out of control until finally, a woman in a white lab coat appeared. She was in her early 40s, sharp-eyed and calm in a way that only made my heart race faster. Claire, she asked gently. I nodded, unable to find my voice. I'm Dr. Patel. Please, come with me. I followed her down a long hallway, my footsteps echoing off the sterile floors. Every door we passed was closed, hiding secrets I couldn't even begin to imagine. Finally, she stopped in front of one. He's in here, she said softly, her hand resting on the door handle. I opened my mouth, but the only thing that came out was a shaky breath. Dr. Patel must have sensed my hesitation. I know this is overwhelming. But he's asked to see you. I nodded, though every part of me screamed to run. Then she opened the door. The room was small, almost bare, just a bed, a chair, and a single window with blinds half drawn. And in that bed was Ethan. Alive. But he wasn't the same Ethan I remembered, not the man who'd been so fragile and broken in the hospital, nor the vibrant, stubborn man I'd once loved. This Ethan was thinner, his face sharper, haunted. His eyes, those piercing blue eyes, met mine the second I stepped inside, and something in my chest cracked wide open. I took a shaky step forward. Ethan? His lips twitched into something resembling a smile, but there was no warmth in it. Hello, Claire. I felt my knees weaken. I gripped the back of the chair to steady myself, staring at him as if I could will an explanation out of thin air. You're alive, I whispered, as if saying it out loud would make it real. Looks like it, he replied dryly. My heart raced. 1,000 emotions surged through me, relief, confusion, anger. Mostly anger. I stepped closer, my voice rising. What the hell is going on? I was at your funeral. I buried you. I mourned you. And now you're just here? Ethan's gaze didn't waver. I know. That's all you have to say? I snapped, my hands trembling. You let me think you were dead. He sighed, leaning back against the pillows, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. It wasn't my choice. What does that even mean? Before he could answer, Dr. Patel spoke quietly from behind me. Perhaps you should sit down. I didn't want to sit. I wanted answers. But my legs gave out anyway, and I collapsed into the chair. Dr. Patel crossed the room, standing beside Ethan's bed. Ethan has been part of a government witness protection program. I stared at her, my mind blank. Witness protection. I repeated, the words foreign on my tongue. She nodded. There was an incident. A case he was involved in. His life was in danger, and to ensure his safety, it was necessary to stage his death. I blinked, my brain struggling to catch up. What incident? What are you talking about? He wasn't involved in anything like that. Ethan's jaw clenched, his gaze darkening. You didn't know everything about me, Claire. A chill crept down my spine. Dr. Patel continued, her voice calm but firm. The details are classified. But what you need to know is that Ethan's life was at risk. Faking his death was the only way to protect him. I shook my head, my heart racing. So you let me believe he was gone? You let me grieve him? Ethan's eyes met mine, filled with something I couldn't place, regret? Pain? Guilt? I didn't have a choice, he said softly. They told me I couldn't contact anyone from my past. Not even you. I swallowed the lump in my throat, my mind spinning. But why now? I whispered. Why tell me this after all this time? Ethan hesitated, then spoke the words that shattered whatever fragile reality I'd been clinging to. Because I'm dying, Claire. For real this time. Because I'm dying, Claire. For real this time. Those words hit harder than the first time I thought I'd lost him. This wasn't the sterile finality of a heart monitor flatlining. No, this was worse. This was knowing he was slipping away while I stood here, again, with no power to stop it. But this time, it wasn't sudden. This time, I'd have to watch. I gripped the arms of the chair like it was the only thing keeping me from falling apart. Ethan, I whispered, my voice trembling. How is this even possible? He sighed, leaning his head back against the stiff hospital pillow, his face shadowed under the harsh fluorescent lights. It's complicated, he rasped, his eyes distant as if he was reliving something I couldn't see. After I left, or rather, after they made me disappear, things didn't go as planned. I leaned forward, desperate to bridge the impossible distance between us. What things? Why couldn't you tell me? Why did you have to die twice? Ethan chuckled bitterly. Because I was already dead to you the first time. The words stung more than I expected. Maybe because they were true. Doctor. Patel cleared her throat gently, pulling a chair closer to Ethan's bed. Claire, Ethan's involvement wasn't something he chose. It was a matter of circumstance, wrong place, wrong time. But what he knew put his life in jeopardy. That's why the government intervened. I shook my head, trying to piece together the fragments. But he wasn't involved in anything dangerous. Ethan ran his own business. He worked with contracts. Ethan interrupted, his voice low. But not the kind you think. Some of the projects I handled weren't just about business. I stumbled onto information I shouldn't have seen, financials tied to people with too much to lose if the truth got out. I stared at him, my heart pounding. What kind of people? The kind who make people disappear, he replied flatly. A chill crept up my spine. This wasn't the man I remembered. There was an edge to him now, sharp and jagged, like life had carved pieces out of him I hadn't noticed were missing before. Ethan continued, his words slow, deliberate. When I found out what they were hiding, they didn't just come after me, they threatened everyone I cared about. Including you. I felt the air leave my lungs. So they staged your death, to protect me? I whispered. He nodded. It was the only way. I covered my mouth, trying to hold back the sob threatening to escape. All this time, I thought I was the villain in our story. But maybe, just maybe, we both were victims of something bigger than either of us. How did you survive? I finally asked, my voice raw. Ethan glanced at Dr. Patel before answering. I went underground. New identity. New life. They moved me around, kept me in safe houses. It was hell, Claire. I was alive, but not really living. His gaze met mine, filled with exhaustion and something else, regret. I thought about you every day, he whispered. But I couldn't reach out. They said any contact would put you in danger. A bitter laugh escaped my lips. So instead, you let me grieve you. You let me think you were gone, that I stopped myself, swallowing the lump in my throat. That you'd lost me, he finished softly. But Claire, you'd already lost me long before that. The weight of his words settled over us like a thick fog. I wanted to scream at him, to demand why he didn't fight harder to come back. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't change anything. Nothing could. Doctor. Patel broke the silence, her tone clinical but kind. Ethan's condition is critical. The stress he's endured over the years took a toll on his body, and the illness progressed faster than we expected. I blinked, trying to process her words. What illness? Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, Ethan answered before she could. It's aggressive. They found it too late. The room spun. I gripped the chair harder, as if holding on could keep reality from slipping away. But there's treatment, right? Chemo, surgery, something, I stammered. Ethan shook his head. It's past that. They've done what they can. It's just a matter of time now. Time. The one thing we'd run out of long before I ever walked back into his life. Days passed in a blur. I stayed, even though every part of me wanted to run. I sat by his bedside, holding his hand when he let me, pretending the past didn't weigh us down like an anchor. Ava visited too. We never talked much, just exchanged polite nods, two women orbiting the same dying man. She'd been there for him when I couldn't be, and that truth was both comforting and unbearable. One evening, when the sun dipped low and painted the hospital walls in shades of orange and gold, Ethan reached for my hand. His grip was weak, but his eyes held a familiar strength. I don't hate you, he whispered. Tears welled in my eyes. You should. He smiled faintly. Maybe. But hate takes energy I don't have anymore. I squeezed his hand gently, afraid to let go. I loved you, Claire. Despite everything. The dam broke. I sobbed quietly, my forehead resting against his hand. I loved you too, I whispered through the tears. I still do. He didn't respond. And for a terrifying moment, I thought he was gone. But then his fingers twitched slightly, the faintest squeeze back. I don't know how many more days I have with him. Maybe weeks. Maybe less. But I do know this. I thought our story ended the day I broke his heart. But maybe it was just waiting for the right chapter to begin. And now. I'm terrified of how it's going to end. The days after Ethan's confession felt like they existed outside the boundaries of real time. The world moved on beyond the sterile white walls of his hospital room, but inside, everything felt suspended, fragile, like a glass ornament teetering on the edge of a shelf. I lived in that space between breaths, waiting for the inevitable. But no matter how much I tried to prepare myself, the idea of losing him again felt like an open wound that would never heal. This time, there would be no faking, no staged funeral. Just the raw, unbearable finality of death. And I wasn't ready. Ethan's strength faded with each passing day. His body grew thinner, his voice softer, but his eyes, those piercing blue eyes, still held the same stubborn fire I fell in love with. Some nights, he'd drift into restless sleep, mumbling things that pulled me back to memories I thought I'd buried. Claire, do you remember Paris? The words slipped out one evening as he stirred, his eyes half open but distant. Paris. We weren't rich back then, but Ethan had surprised me with a cheap flight and a cramped little apartment he found online. It was our first real trip together, filled with late-night walks along the Seine, stolen kisses under dim streetlights, and arguments over maps when we inevitably got lost. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. Yeah, I whispered, brushing a stray curl from his damp forehead. I remember. His lips twitched into a faint smile. You hated the coffee there. I laughed softly, tears blurring my vision. It tasted like burnt regret. He chuckled weakly, his fingers brushing against mine. That fragile touch felt heavier than 1,000 words. Those moments, fleeting as they were, kept me grounded. But they also made every day feel like a countdown I couldn't control. Ava visited less frequently as Ethan grew weaker. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe she was giving me space. Either way, I was grateful. The air felt lighter without the tension of unspoken words hanging between us. But one afternoon, she stayed. We sat on opposite sides of Ethan's bed, the quiet stretching between us like an invisible wall. He was asleep, his breathing shallow and uneven, the only sound filling the room. Finally, Ava broke the silence. You know, she said quietly, staring at the floor, he talked about you a lot. I looked up, caught off guard. Ava's fingers fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve. After he disappeared. You were still there with him? In his head. In his heart. Her words landed like tiny, sharp pins, pricking at the guilt I'd tried to bury. I thought I'd moved on, I whispered, more to myself than to her. But I never really did. She nodded, her jaw tightening. Neither did he. I expected anger, resentment, something to match the guilt gnawing at me. But Ava's voice was soft, almost fragile when she spoke again. You broke his heart, Claire. But he never hated you for it. I bit the inside of my cheek, fighting back tears. Maybe he should have. She didn't argue. Because we both knew it was true. A week later, Ethan's condition took a sharp turn. The doctors called it the final decline, as if putting clinical words to it would soften the blow. But there's no softening death. It's sharp, unforgiving. I stayed by his side, afraid to sleep, afraid that if I closed my eyes, I'd wake up and he'd be gone. Late one night, when the world outside was dark and still, he stirred. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then locking onto mine with surprising clarity. "Claire," he rasped, his voice barely more than a breath. I leaned closer, gripping his frail hand. "I'm here," I whispered, my heart pounding. He swallowed with difficulty, his eyes glassy but intense. "I need to ask you something." "Anything." A shaky breath. "Don't let me die alone." The words shattered me. Tears spilled down my cheeks, but I forced myself to nod, my voice a fragile whisper. "I won't. I promise." His hand tightened around mine, a weak, trembling squeeze, but it was enough. Enough to tether me to him, even as he slipped further away. It happened in the early hours of the morning. I was half asleep, my head resting on the edge of his bed, still holding his hand when I felt it, the absence. No more faint rise and fall of his chest. No more warmth in his fingers. Just stillness. I sat up slowly, my heart refusing to accept what my eyes already knew. "Ethan?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Nothing." I pressed my forehead against his hand, sobbing quietly. I'd promised not to let him die alone. And I hadn't. But in that moment, I'd never felt more alone in my life. The funeral was small, simple, just like Ethan would have wanted. Ava stood across from me, her face pale but composed. We didn't speak much. There was nothing left to say. I kept the letter he'd written me tucked in my purse, the paper worn from being unfolded and refolded too many times. It was the last piece of him I had. Or so I thought. Weeks after the funeral, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address. Just my name scrawled across the front in handwriting I recognized immediately. Ethan's. With trembling hands, I opened it. Inside was a simple note. "Claire, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. But I left something behind that you need to know about. Go to the storage unit. The key is inside." A small key slipped out of the envelope, landing in my palm. I stared at it, my heart racing. "What did you leave behind, Ethan?" The key felt heavier than it should have, its cold metal pressing into my palm like it carried the weight of everything Ethan never told me. I stared at the simple note, the shaky loops of his handwriting etched into my memory now more than ever. Go to the storage unit. I didn't know what I expected to find. Maybe a box of old photographs, letters he never sent, remnants of the life we'd shared, or the life he lived without me. But the uncertainty was suffocating, and the key burned like a question I couldn't ignore. The storage facility was on the outskirts of town, tucked between rows of warehouses and forgotten parking lots. The sky was overcast when I arrived, gray clouds swirling like they carried secrets of their own. I gave the receptionist the unit number written on Ethan's note. She barely looked up, handing me a clipboard to sign before pointing down a long corridor lined with identical metal doors. Unit 317. My fingers trembled as I slid the key into the lock. The metal clicked, the door groaning as I pulled it open. Inside, dust particles floated lazily in the dim light filtering through the small window near the ceiling. The space was small, just a few stacked boxes, an old duffel bag, and a battered metal filing cabinet shoved against the wall. Nothing extraordinary. But my heart raced like I'd just stumbled upon something forbidden. I approached the boxes first, kneeling on the cold concrete floor as I peeled back the brittle tape. Inside were photographs, some I recognized from our life together, vacations, birthdays, lazy Sunday mornings when we thought love was invincible. But mixed among them were pictures I'd never seen. Photos of Ethan after I was gone, him in different cities, standing beside unfamiliar faces, his smile forced, his eyes never quite reaching the camera. It hit me like a punch to the chest. He had lived an entire life I knew nothing about. Tucked between the photos was a letter addressed to me. Claire. I didn't know if I'd ever get the chance to explain everything. Maybe I was a coward for not doing it sooner. But I hope, somehow, this reaches you when it matters most. There are things I couldn't tell you, not because I didn't want to, but because I thought I was protecting you. Maybe that was just an excuse. Maybe I was really protecting myself from the truth, that no matter how far I ran, I never outran what we were. But there's something more important than my regrets. You need to know the truth. My hands trembled as I lowered the letter, my heart pounding. The truth about what? I stood up, my knees stiff from the cold floor, and moved toward the filing cabinet. The key Ethan had left also fit the small lock on the top drawer. Inside were files, government documents stamped with words like confidential and restricted access. I flipped through them, my heart racing faster with each page. And then I saw it. A name I didn't expect. Mine. There was a file on me, my name, my photo, details about my life after Ethan died. It listed addresses, jobs, even notes about people I'd spoken to. I felt my stomach twist, bile rising in my throat. Why would Ethan have this? My hands shook as I flipped to the next section. And that's when I saw it. A birth certificate. My name listed under mother. And under father. Ethan Hale. I felt the blood drain from my face. What is this? My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was holding. I don't have a child. But the certificate was real, stamped, dated, from 3 years ago. Which was impossible. Unless. No. I stumbled back, my heart racing so fast it felt like it might burst. What did you do, Ethan? I barely made it back to my car, my hands shaking as I tried to process what I'd just found. Then my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but something told me to answer. Hello? I croaked, my voice raw. There was a pause. Then a woman's voice, soft but urgent. Is this Claire Hale? Yes, who is this? I think we need to meet. It's about Ethan. My chest tightened. Who are you? Another pause. Then, softly. I'm his daughter. I'm his daughter. The words echoed in my mind, louder than the woman's voice on the other end of the call. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I couldn't think. The birth certificate still sat in my lap, trembling slightly with the force of my shaking hands. Ethan's daughter. Our daughter? But that was impossible. I would have known. Wouldn't I? My voice came out in a rasp, raw and shaky. What did you just say? The woman on the other end took a breath, her tone steady but fragile beneath the surface. My name is Lily. Ethan Hale was my father. And you're Claire, right? I swallowed hard, trying to find my footing in a conversation that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. Yes, I whispered. I'm Claire. Another pause. Then, we need to meet. There's something you need to know. We agreed to meet at a small cafe downtown. I didn't remember the drive there. My mind was a storm of memories, questions, and impossible scenarios, all crashing against each other like waves. When I walked in, I spotted her immediately. She was sitting alone at a corner table, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of her. She looked up when the door chimed, her eyes meeting mine. And I felt my heart stop. Those eyes, Ethan's eyes. She had his sharp cheekbones, his stubborn jawline, even the same nervous habit of tapping her fingers on the table. But she was a stranger. I approached slowly, my legs feeling unsteady. Lily? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, standing up to greet me. She was in her early 20s, her hair tied back in a messy bun, wearing a simple jacket and jeans. Ordinary. And yet, everything but ordinary. We sat in silence for a moment, the air thick with unspoken words. Finally, she broke it. I'm sorry to just call you like that, she said softly. I found your number in some of my dad's things after he passed. I nodded, my throat too tight to respond. She continued, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her cup. I know this is probably a lot. It's a lot for me too. But I needed to find you. I took a shaky breath. I don't understand. Ethan never told me about you. How is that even possible? Her lips pressed into a thin line. Because I wasn't supposed to exist. Lily leaned back, her gaze distant as she began to speak. My mother's name was Sarah, she said quietly. She met Ethan after he left you. They weren't together long. It was complicated. But she got pregnant, and by the time she found out, he was already gone, pulled into whatever mess he was running from. I felt a knot tighten in my chest. Sarah. A name Ethan never mentioned. He didn't know about me, Lily continued. Not until a few years ago. My mom tracked him down after she got sick. She wanted me to meet him before, she trailed off, her voice softening. Before she died. I covered my mouth, the weight of her words crashing down on me. He didn't have much time left when I met him, Lily said, her eyes glistening. But he wanted me to know him. And he wanted me to know you. Tears blurred my vision, but I blinked them back. Why me? I whispered. Lily reached into her bag and pulled out a small, battered journal. She slid it across the table toward me. He wrote about you. All the time, she said softly. I think he never really let you go. My hands trembled as I opened the journal. Ethan's handwriting filled the pages, messy and familiar, like a voice from the past. Claire would have laughed at this me writing in a journal. She always said I was terrible at keeping my thoughts organized. I felt my heart clench. Page after page, he wrote about memories, our first trip together, the day we moved into our apartment, the fights, the apologies, the quiet moments in between. But as I read on, the entries shifted. I met Lily today. She has my eyes. But she has Claire's stubbornness. It's funny how life works. I lost one family and found another. Tears streamed down my face, splattering the ink, blurring the words. I never stopped loving Claire. But maybe this is my second chance to be better. To not screw it up. I closed the journal, my heart shattering into pieces I didn't know existed. Lily pulled out one last thing, a sealed envelope with my name scrawled on the front. He wrote this for you, she whispered. I opened it with trembling fingers. Claire. If you're reading this, I'm gone. But I couldn't leave without saying everything I should have said when I had the chance. I never hated you. I thought I did, but the truth is, I hated how much I still loved you, even after everything. You were the best part of my life, even when it ended badly. I found out about Lily too late. But she gave me something I never thought I'd have again, hope. She reminded me of you in ways that hurt and healed all at once. I'm sorry for leaving. I'm sorry for all of it. But I hope you know that you were my first love, my last thought, and everything in between. Goodbye, Claire. Ethan, Lily and I sat in silence for a long time after that. There was nothing left to say. But as I looked at her, at the living, breathing piece of Ethan sitting across from me, I realized something. Maybe our story didn't end with goodbye. Maybe it was still being written. Not in the pages of journals or letters, but in the quiet spaces where love lingers long after it's gone. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The end.